Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's anti-founder is General William Howe, commander of the North American forces, who wasn't George Washington. He was commanding the other team. And to help us learn about Mr. Howe, well, we'd like to welcome back Michael Troy from the American Revolution podcast. Michael, thank you for coming back to us.
Hi, Jason. Happy to be here.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about Howe. Maybe you could shed some light on what General Howe was up to before the American Revolution began.
Well, General Howe was a career officer. He, like most career officers, came from a very wealthy and powerful British family. His father was a viscount. His mother was the illegitimate half sister of King George I. So he came from the very top echelons of British society. Um, but he was the third son, so he wasn't going to inherit any money, title, property, any of that good stuff. So he joined the army. And at age 17, his dad bought him a cornet position in the army, which is the equivalent of a second lieutenant in our modern army. And he got started on his military career.
Very interesting. The cornet, not a musical instrument. And I should, as we were saying before we started, I should call him Lord Howe, you pointed out, not General Howe.
Um, Correct. Through most of the war, he was not Lord Howe, but at the end of his life, he very much was Lord Howe. And
Okay,
we'll get
fair enough. And so he goes out a warring around the world, and I understand he makes it to America for. Does he serve in America for the 7 Years' War?
Yeah, he's actually early enough that he fought in the War of Austrian Succession for a few years, and after that became good friends with James Wolfe, who was, of course, a famous general in the French and Indian War. So yeah, he came over to America for the French and Indian War and fought at the siege of Louisburg, and he played a really leading role in the siege of Quebec, where General Wolfe was killed.
And the siege of Quebec being one of the main ones that ended up with the British, of course, winning that war and taking over Canada.
Right, that result in French Canada becoming British Canada. Um, and of course, the Seven Years' War continued on after the French and Indian War ended. And Howe, who by that time I think was a major or a captain or a major by the end of the war, went off to fight in France for a time and also fought in Cuba.
Oh, interesting. I did not realize that. So after Cuba, I understand he'll return to Great Britain. And when the American Revolutionary War begins, he's not in North America yet.
No, while he was off fighting in the Seven Years' War, his family got him elected to the House of Commons, which was it was very common for the children or brothers of lords to serve in the House of Commons. Very wealthy families essentially controlled various seats and gave them to the kids that didn't get titles. So by the time his father died when he was really young, his father was in somewhere in the Caribbean. I want to say Barbados, but I could be wrong about that. Somewhere in the Caribbean, went down there to become governor, died of a disease within a matter of months, and left four very young boys without a father. So his older brother, Richard, became Lord Howe at a very young age, and William, as the second son, took a seat in the House of Commons.
Right. It makes a lot of sense that, as we were saying earlier, doesn't the younger sons can't be the nobility or inherit all the land. So coming into the House of Commons, they could still keep control of the entire government that way.
Right, and the House of Commons was not full of commoners. It was full of people who technically didn't have titles as lords, but were very much tied into the aristocracy of Great Britain.
Right. So this is the scenario when the war breaks out, as we were saying, the American Revolutionary War. Um, do we know? Obviously, General Gage that we spoke about last time was originally in charge for the most part of what was going on, but they decided to send Howe over to take command. Can you speak a little bit about how he achieved that position and what he was expecting maybe when he came over?
Yeah, General Howe, as I said, was an active member of the House of Commons, and in the House of Commons was an opponent of the war and of British policy. He thought that the British were being way too hard on the Americans, or on the colonists, as they were called, that he wanted to support a negotiation with them so that they would stay friendly and stay part of the empire on a voluntary basis. And he thought using the military was a big mistake, that they would never have the resources to really crush the entire continent the way they would have to if they went that route. And he was right. So he actually told his constituents at one point that he would never serve in America, that he was that against the war. Um, I think that was a little disingenuous. At the same time, he was kind of schmoozing with some of the leaders in London to get a position as second in command in North America behind Gage, and he knew that Gage was pretty unpopular at the time. By this time, by the time the war began, he was already a major general. He'd been promoted to major general in 1772. So he gets sent over to Boston in 1775. And when he gets on the ship in London to leave, word has not reached London about Lexington and Concord yet. He does not know that they're at war. But he gets on a ship with two other major generals, Henry Clinton and Johnny Burgoyne, and they take a ship over to Boston, and they arrive in it's late May or early June of 1775. They get to the city and find it under siege by this huge New England army. And
What do you mean there's a war?
guess what? War's broken out and it's time to fix it. So, of course, like with junior officers, the first thing they do is start sending letters back home to say that, they're way better than Gage. Gage is an idiot. Gage needs to be replaced. Um,
Well,
Very politely, of course, but
right. And it's very interesting to me, actually, too, that, you were saying Howe was saying we shouldn't fight them. We're probably not going to win. And as we mentioned last time we spoke, Gage was saying we need way more soldiers if we actually want to win this war. So, in a fashion, as you're saying, they were saying Gage wasn't quite prepared, but Gage was also saying he wasn't quite prepared.
right. Well, what every general does when they come in is they accuse the previous general of not being aggressive enough, and that's exactly what they accuse Gage of doing.
Yeah.
He should have taken a firmer hand earlier on. He shouldn't have let this get so out of control. He should have arrested, the ringleaders earlier on. All this stuff. Um,
It's one of the things I've learned most listening to your podcast is just how much trash the British generals would talk about each other
right.
constantly. I feel like every episode it's one general going behind the back of another. It's really interesting.
Right. And I put it very bluntly, the generals, of course, do not. They're very polite and
Oh
respectful
yeah.
of their superiors, and putting it, maybe we should have done it just this other way, or, very nice about it, but
Well, no
they're
one's going
getting
to
it.
challenge you to a duel. You could
All
say
right,
it as it is.
right. But you want to look like you're being disinterested, like you're not trying to knock down your superior so you can take his place. That
Right.
level of ambition is considered inappropriate and would not get you ahead.
Right. Well, it's interesting because I know the American founders, and I wonder if I'm assuming the British would be like this too. With they looked at virtue, what they consider public virtue, very differently than we would use the word virtue, where you're supposed to have this disinterestedness, and it's your duty as a leading citizen to help your country and your community, as opposed to trying to be what's the word ambitious, even though
Right.
you were being ambitious.
Britain at this time was the exact opposite of social mobility or economic mobility or any of that. Everybody had their position in life at birth, and that really wasn't supposed to change at all. And even movement up or down in the army was very limited. You were much more likely to become a general if your father was a general or held some other very important position in government. And really, that was part of the reason that British soldiers purchased their commissions. Um, it was some people think of that as corruption or something, but no, it was the policy of the army to buy and sell commissions, and a cornet or a lieutenancy was very less expensive than a captain or a major or a colonel. Part of the reason behind selling commissions, although they didn't really say this, but this is my theory, was that they wanted members of the establishment to hold the top positions in the army. They did not want social climbers. They did not want people that came from the lower classes and the oppressed and made their way up to positions of power where they might someday have a revolution. They wanted the children of the very rich and wealthy to be running the army so that they would not want to overthrow their father and their brother.
Right. Well, when you're running the wealthiest, most powerful empire in the history of the world at the time, you could see why people would want to keep the status quo going.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So interesting. So how, as we said, he gets to America. Oh wow, there's a war going on here. Where does he go from there? Does he stick around in Boston, or does he go on adventures?
Yeah, the first thing they decide they need to do is take some more land around Boston. And Howe is put in charge of taking a small hill just north of the city called Bunker Hill. And he actually commands the um, invasion that day as second in command. Gage basically sits back and lets Howe run the whole show. And of course, Howe does take Bunker Hill in that day, but it is probably the bloodiest day of the war for the British Army. They just take a massive amount of casualties in doing that. And it really, um, one of the things that the officers all came over from Britain with the idea of is that militia will never stand up to British regulars. And, 10 British regulars can take out 100 militia without a problem. Of course, they had thousands of regulars going up against hundreds of militia at Bunker Hill, and the Americans proved them wrong. And this is where they really got educated that no, these guys are not a bunch of yokels who don't know what they're doing. They will stand, they will fight, they won't run at the first sight of gunpowder.
Right. Well, it's funny you say that because I have read the not too long ago I read a book about Stark, John Stark, and it talks a lot about both the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, and one of the many, many, many reasons the American Revolution broke out, at least is implied in this text, is you have these militia officers, not just George Washington, but many militia officers from all across the colonies who go fight with the British Army, and even though they're officers in the militia, they are treated as second class soldiers in a fashion, or just privates to be sent off, which irked many people the wrong way. So you could
Yeah,
see
during
how
the
they
French and Indian War, a lieutenant in the regular army could give orders to a militia general.
right, and they didn't love that, and that may have in many ways contributed to the Americans, we'll say, eagerness to fight, so to speak, especially the officers. So Hal learns a pretty substantial lesson, as you said. After this, Gates hangs around for about a year, if I recall. Does Gates makes it until the evacuation, or does he,
No, Gage leaves in, I believe, October.
or September? Okay,
Um, it, when word of Bunker Hill gets back to London, London pretty much almost immediately sends back a message saying Gage come home. Um, so Gage leaves, yeah, I think in early October, and Howe becomes the new commander of North America at that point, and he commands in Boston all winter. Um, there is they had pretty much decided even before Gage left that they wanted to get out of Boston, that just wasn't a good position to be in under siege and only being able to be supplied by ships. Um, the plan was to move to New York, but they didn't want to do it you know, until they had more reinforcements and everything to really hit New York hard. So they were basically just sitting and waiting during the winter. And as much as Howe criticized Gage for doing nothing for the prior year, Howe pretty much did nothing all winter long except sit around and play cards. And he did procure a mistress for himself.
and I don't recall the exact scenario of that. I understand it was a loyalist's spouse.
Yeah, Joshua Loring was he held some position in the British Army dealing with the management of prisoners of war. And the idea was that um, General Howe let him pretty much embezzle a lot of the money that was meant for the prisoners in exchange for Loring letting him to sleep with his wife Betsy. So it was an arrangement that I guess worked out well for all concerned as far as they were concerned.
Sounds like a good time. So eventually he does evacuate Boston and they make their way to New York. And he spends a significant portion of the war overseeing things from New York, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he's forced to go to Halifax because the Americans bring the cannons up to Dorchester Heights and, of course, force the British out a little earlier than they'd hoped to be. They really wanted to stick around until about June and then head down to Staten Island at that point. So Howe has to go up to Halifax for a couple of months. There's a little confusion over that because troops are arriving, and there's actually a few troops. There's a story of one officer, I forget who it was now, who shows up at Boston about a month after the British evacuated, not realizing it, lands at um, Boston Harbor and promptly becomes a prisoner of war for the next 2 years.
Right.
So,
Right.
but yeah, so the British eventually get their act together, get everything organized, head down to Staten Island, then invade, take over New York City, and um, that's the whole New York campaign where they push the Americans up north out of Manhattan and then across the river into New Jersey and then essentially all the way across to Philadelphia.
Right. And I would assume that that is Howe's crowning achievement of the war itself. The fact that he was able to extinguish the Patriots from New York, except perhaps letting George Washington sneak away in the middle of the night.
Yeah, General Howe had really overwhelming force. He had close to 50,000 men at New York. And as I said, I've probably said this before on the show, we don't think of 50,000 as a lot of soldiers in the 19th century. It was a lot of soldiers in the 18th century. It was more soldiers than the entire British Empire had under arms a few years before the war began.
Right. I
So,
mean, New York, New York City had less than 10,000 residents. Like, what was the largest city? Philly had like maybe 20,000 people. So,
yeah, between 20 and 30,000. But
so
yeah,
today New York has like 8 million people. That is like 20 million people in your army. I know
yeah,
that's
it
not
was
the best metaphor for it, but
right. But right, you had 50,000 soldiers. They were all regulars or Hessians. So they were all professional soldiers. And they were basically going up against 20, 25,000 inexperienced militia. I mean, they were technically Continentals at that point, but they hadn't been trained like we expect Continentals were later in the war.
right,
So yeah, he basically goes in, pushes them out of New York. He's criticized by a lot of people, including his underling Clinton, who's following the tradition of always criticize the commander,
right,
um, for not. Clinton wanted to land north of Manhattan and basically cut off the entire Continental Army in New York City and just crush and destroy them. And Howe said, no, we're not going to do that. This was part of his whole policy of being nice to the Americans and just proving that loss was going to be inevitable for the Americans, so they should just, understand that very quickly without it getting too bloody. He was just going to push them out of New York, show that, he could pretty much march wherever he wanted, take whatever he wanted, and the Americans would get the idea and give up and surrender.
right. We want the Americans to want to be part of the British Empire.
Right. He didn't want a huge slaughter. He thought that a slaughter would make enemies of the colonists in a
Right,
way that they weren't at this point. That they really were still family, and this was a family dispute. And Big Brother had to knock some sense into the little kid, but we didn't want to get this to get too crazy.
right. You don't want to give many martyrs or anything like that. Interesting. So, as we said, he does take New York City, would hold on to it for 8 years, essentially. Um, let's talk about a little bit more through the war. So eventually, he is sends out. He goes out on the Philadelphia campaign. Does he? My mind's escaping me. Does he join the Philadelphia campaign, or does he send Cornwallis?
Yeah, that's the first time he actually ventures out of New York. After he captures New York City, he sends most of his army under Cornwallis to take New Jersey, but he doesn't participate in the conquering of New Jersey. He sits in New York, plays a lot of cards, brings down his mistress from Boston, and has a good old time. Um, So, of course, they had hoped to just winter would be a nice calm time, but of course Washington had that nasty crossing of the Delaware and retaking Trenton and creating a whole mess in New Jersey over the winter. Howe just kind of watches that from afar and says, "Cornwallis, fix it." Um,
Right. Oh, Germans.
yeah, it did not go well. Um, so the next year, we're talking 1777 now. The British try to plan what they're going to do for the next campaign season during the winter and then launch it in the spring because you don't want your men out marching in the snow and cold and dying of all sorts of diseases from exposure. So over the winter, they try to come up with a plan, and Howe is basically demanding, I need twice as many troops as you sent me 50,000 and 10% of them are already dead or captured. So but I need 80 or 90,000. I want to send an army into New England. I want to send an army into New York. I want to send an army down toward Philadelphia. I need more men. And, the bean counters in London are saying, these cost money, right? We're fighting this war because we were out of money and in debt, right?
Right. And
So
it's
they want a victory on the budget. Howe's not getting it. He's not getting his men. So he really has a hissy fit and says, all right, well, then I can't conquer the continent. he under he learns that Burgoyne has gone back to London and convinced them that Burgoyne is going to be able to conquer the entire continent on the cheap with only a few thousand men. This is not going to be a problem. You just have to show some uh, moxie and it'll all work out. And they give Burgoyne the opportunity to start in Quebec and march all the way down to New York City. Howe hears about this and says, well, I can't let Burgoyne get all the glory. And if I help him, essentially I'm going to look like a support role in the British victory. So he really has no interest in helping Burgoyne at all. And he comes up with this plan to go take Philadelphia to gain some glory for himself. And
which he does.
he he does, and he actually gets a lot of criticism not only for doing it but for the way he did it. He could have just marched across New Jersey and taken Philadelphia the way they had almost done the year before. Instead of that, he puts all of his men on ships, sails them all the way down to Maryland, the Chesapeake Bay, which takes, I don't know, 6 or 8 weeks, incredible amount of time. His men start dying from scurvy and stuff while they're going to Maryland, um, and then marches up and takes Philadelphia from the south. What this did, of course, was put his entire army out of position, so there was no way they could possibly support Burgoyne. And all the forces that were in the north could just focus on Burgoyne and not have to worry about being attacked by General Howe in the south. So he gets a lot of criticism for that, even though he takes Philadelphia. And
Right.
he does personally lead it. He participates in the battles at Brandywine and Germantown and all that good stuff. Um, Runs a textbook campaign, does really well, out strategizes Washington at every step. His experience, his knowledge uh, serves him very well in the campaign. And by October, he's successfully ensconced in Philadelphia. He's opened up the Delaware River to the Navy, and he's succeeded in everything he wanted to do that year.
Yeah.
And he
And he,
picks
he
that moment to resign.
oh, hold on.
Well,
Well, he successfully, like, we should reiterate, like, he successfully enters what was essentially the capital of the revolutionary colonies. And the Continental Congress runs away. George Washington has lost the battles. Uh, it's not, seems like a good time to call it quits.
well, it probably would have been. When he quit, he did not yet have news of Burgoyne's complete surrender at Saratoga. Um,
Right, which we did cut off a lot of time. As he's invading Philadelphia, Burgoyne is simultaneously marching down through Ticonderoga to Saratoga.
right, and
And
that's of course where Burgoyne's army is captured, and 6,000 man army. I think that's the first time a British army of that size was ever captured anywhere in any war.
ever,
So
yeah.
it's really shocking to the establishment in London that a bunch of hicks in America could do something like that.
Well, and especially in to Howe's credit, going down south to Philadelphia essentially forces the American army to split in half. I know it was already in these positions, but they really had to focus two separate campaigns simultaneously, which for all intents and purposes, you would expect this ragtag militia, for lack of a better term, to not be able to handle that kind of division. But half of them didn't in Philadelphia, but the other half, thanks to American hero Benedict Arnold.
Well,
People
the
don't like
Americans,
hearing me say, but is absolutely true.
I've said before, I almost wish he had died at Saratoga. He would have been the war's greatest hero. Up until that time,
He
he
would be
was.
one of America's greatest heroes. Absolutely.
Yeah,
To this day.
but he blew it all.
Nope.
But yeah, so right, the Americans are able to defeat Saratoga. So even though Howe wins Philadelphia, he starts immediately getting lots of blame. How did you let this happen? How did you not support Burgoyne? How did you completely, blow off that whole northern theater?
Right.
And
Well, he left General Clinton back in New York.
he left General Clinton in New York with almost no
No
soldiers.
soldier, right?
So Clinton very much wanted to go out and support him, but he had like 2,000 soldiers and he was covering, I don't know how many 100 square miles of defensive territory between Long Island and Manhattan and Staten Island.
Right. And not to
Um,
get too far from Howe, but Clinton does uh some engaging, right? He meets the American Clinton, if I'm not mistaken. He meets the is it the
yeah,
Clinton brothers? Are they both there?
yes, both George and James Clinton are at Fort Clinton in upstate New York, and General Clinton, it's sometimes called the Battle of the Clintons because they're all Clintons.
Right, they're all Clintons.
Um, and they actually are distant cousins, the American Clintons and the British Clinton.
Oh.
I think they're like fourth or fifth cousins, something
Oh,
like that.
okay. Okay.
They didn't know each
They're
other
not going
very
to
well.
Thanksgiving together.
No. But yeah, Clinton actually sallies out, goes up the Hudson River, takes Fort Clinton, gets up as far as where West Point will be eventually built. Even goes up and burns Kingston, New York, which he hopes will be a distraction at least, so
Right.
the Burgoyne can get away.
So you can't
But
say that Burgoyne was completely abandoned. He,
but the men he used, I mean, we're talking about maybe a little more than 1,000 soldiers involved in this campaign. It was
oh
not
no,
a
I
building
agree
force.
with you. I'm just saying General Howe could sit on that. So back to
But
Howe. We don't want to get too far away
well, the
because
other thing I want to say is when General Clinton goes up and burns Kingston, while he's in Kingston, he gets orders from General Howe saying, "Send me about half of your existing forces down to Philadelphia because I need them here."
right,
So
great.
Clinton's getting apoplectic because Howe left him with almost no soldiers, and then as soon as he tries to do something, Howe says, "Well, you had soldiers enough to do something, so send them to me."
Yeah, great, great. Nice try, Clinton. And I will. You will come back. We're going to talk more about Clinton in the future. So let's go back to Howe. We don't want to leave him behind.
Yeah, we
So
got to
he
do
does.
something for
He
him
does
too.
resign, as you said. Takes Philadelphia. I'm champ. He starts getting negative feedback, but he decides to resign. Does he? He then goes back to the greatest of Britons, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, right. As I said, he resigned before he even gets word of Burgoyne's surrender. And the reason he's resigning is he says, seriously, I need 80, 90,000 soldiers to win this thing, and I've got like 40. Um, and he basically says, if you're not going to give me the soldiers, I'm not going to do the job. And, the people in London essentially say, all right, well, then you're not going to do the job. Come home. So,
Okay, so yeah,
so yeah,
I can't
they
paint the house without a paintbrush. Okay, I guess it's gonna stay this color.
yeah, I mean, there's some argument to be made that he wasn't really resigning as much as he was saying, give me what I want or I'll resign, thinking that they might give him what he wanted.
Right.
And of
Which
course,
itself
that,
seems to be a fairly common tactic on both
yeah,
sides of the war.
and that message arrives in London about the same time as the Burgoyne's surrender arrives, and they say, all right, well, you've completely screwed this up, Hal. So yeah, we're going to accept your offer to resign.
So Howe returns to Great Britain without a hero's welcome. Does he?
He is beloved by his army, though. They throw him one of the most massive parties Philadelphia has ever seen, probably the largest party of the 18th century that didn't involve a king.
Oh,
It's called the Mischianza. It's just this huge blowout party all night, drinking and gambling and whoring, and just this massive, massive event that was actually put together by a captain by the name of Andre. who becomes a major a little bit later in the war.
And would
Uh,
later get caught doing some work with Benedict Arnold, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, doesn't pay to work with Benedict Arnold.
No, it doesn't work out. Can you
But
say the
anyway, so
name of
yeah,
it again? The party?
the Mischianza.
The Mischianza. I've never even heard of that.
Oh, I got a whole episode on it.
Okay. Do you?
Yeah,
I
but
couldn't swear. I just caught up. How did I? Maybe I have heard of it, and my memory's failing me. I apologize.
but anyway, so yeah, Howe leaves in the spring of
I just
1778,
listened to
and
the episode about Philadelphia like 2 weeks ago. Man, yeah, I'm sorry. My memory doesn't work anymore. Anyway,
so yeah, by 1778 he's back in London, and he has nothing, no job at that point. Well, he's still a member of the House of Commons, but they're not giving him any more military command.
well, yeah, so it's a job. And essentially, that's it for How, from our perspective,
Yeah, as
from the
far as
American perspective.
American war is concerned, Howe is done. When he goes back to London, he gets a lot of criticism for the way he invaded Philadelphia and left Burgoyne hanging and all that stuff. He eventually demands a hearing. Both he and his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, have hearings in 1779 where they talk about everything that happened, and it's basically inconclusive. It doesn't really absolve him, but it doesn't condemn him either. The greatest thing I find out about the hearings is that that's where we have some of our best records about what the British strategy was during the war.
Right, because
So
he's
the
open about it.
historians, it's great. They went over everything about the Philadelphia campaign and how it was all supposed to work and how it did work and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's excellent. And you know what? It's funny we barely even mentioned it. That his brother Admiral Howe was he Commodore of the or was he in charge of the British Navy in the
Yeah.
North American seas? I don't know how to say it.
He was the commander of the North American station. Um, Admiral Howe came over about 6 months after General Howe took command. And the idea was the Army and Navy never got along in Britain. They were constantly at odds with one another. And the admiral who was there at the time, oh, I can't remember his name now, but he, of course, he didn't get along with Howe. He didn't get along with Gage before Howe. Um, the people in London thought, well, if we send his brother over, maybe the Army and Navy will actually get along and coordinate their actions properly. And they were right. They actually did work very well together when the two brothers were in charge. And as I said, I mentioned earlier, William Howe was very much against the war. His brother Richard Howe was also very much against the war.
Yeah.
And Richard only agreed to come to America if he and his brother were appointed as peace commissioners.
I was just thinking that they were the ones who worked together to talk to. Did they talk to Sullivan or did they talk to Adams and Franklin?
Yeah, Adams and Franklin and somebody else. Yeah,
I want
well,
to say like
Sullivan
Edmund or a Rand. Was it a Randolph?
might have been. I forget who the third
Yeah,
one
no,
was.
Sullivan. He talked to them when he was captured, and that was
Right.
controversial.
Sullivan,
Yeah,
Sullivan was a prisoner of war, and they released him to go down to talk to Congress and arrange
right,
for peace talks.
right. And
And
then they sent Franklin and Adams, where they have that famous "open the window, close the window"
yeah,
conversation. If I'm not mistaken, where they couldn't sleep. One would get up and open the window and go to sleep. The other one would get up and close the window. And Benny Franks and John Adams making friends that would last a very long time. Who was the
yeah.
third person? Oh man, I want to say it was a Randolph. No, was it Edmund Pendleton?
It probably wasn't Randolph because Randolph was from Virginia, and they probably sent somebody from another colony. I forget who it was
Wouldn't they?
though.
Well, because Franklin from Pennsylvania and Adams from Massachusetts. Oh, that bothers me.
Oh, you're right. It might be. I
You know
don't
what?
know.
What was it? What was the American Revolution Peace Talks? What was it called? I'm looking it up. It's not going to happen because it's going to give me the Treaty of Paris over and over again. Oh, Staten Island Peace Conference.
Yeah, that's it.
If I click the right button. Sorry, viewers, for this brief hold, because I got to know who it is. It was Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, one of the Rutledge brothers. I knew it was one of the famous families. That's right. It was Edward because his brother John had what's was it like? Shouldn't get too far off topic, but John Rutledge was, you know, Stamp Act Congress, Declaration of Independence, like Constitutional Convention, I believe, second
I
Chief
think
Justice, and then that didn't go right, and he tried to kill himself because he said some things in public about George Washington that you're just not supposed to say.
you can't do that.
No. Anywho,
But yeah,
as for William Howe, well, as we said in 1779, he has that discussion with Great Britain, which doesn't really come to much. And then I'm not familiar with any of his life after that. Does he go back to war, or does he kind of retire gracefully from there?
no, he was an opponent of the war, and he actually lost re-election to the House of Commons in 1780. So at that point, he really is doing nothing, but he still has the favor of the king because he comes from a powerful family, and you can't piss off powerful families even when you're the king. You have to find some nice make work jobs for these guys somewhere else to keep everybody happy and in the family. So in 1782, he actually gets promotion to lieutenant general, what we would call a three-star general. Um, oh, I'm sorry, no, he was lieutenant general before then. He gets a position as lieutenant general of the ordnance, which is a special position in London.
Okay.
And he's also appointed to the Privy Council at that point.
Oh, okay. So he
He,
ends up becoming really significant.
well, I wouldn't call it significant. It's one of those jobs where you put important people that don't have it do anything very important.
Sure.
Uh,
Significant.
they're positions of honor, and you get some good money out of it, and it keeps you from being happy and wanting to start a revolution or something.
Which
So,
Britain was having problems with, which most of Europe began having problems with
well,
about that time.
that's the whole job of a king is to know, who to crush and who to, flip a few dollars to,
Right.
and keeping that balance is a tricky game.
Yeah.
Uh, but right, Hal came from, as I said, a valuable and important family. You don't crush somebody like that; you buy them off.
Yeah.
So he got bought off. He got a nice cushy job, and it was respectful. Um, in 1793, after the French Revolution began, Britain was once again at war with France. And at that point, Howe does get promoted to full general, four-star general. So he does not go into combat. By this point, I think he's probably in his late 60s or early 70s. So he's basically uh, doing organizational things in London as a general, but doesn't really do a whole lot else. And he gets one more promotion in his life in 1799. His brother Richard, Admiral Lord Howe, dies and is childless. So General Howe finally becomes Lord Howe, the
There you go.
fifth Viscount Howe, which he holds until his own death in 1814.
He makes it. Nobility. We did it. Great. Well, that is a very thorough overview of the life of General William Howe, Lord Viscount William Howe, I should say. Michael, thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Founder fans, again, Michael Troy, American Revolution Podcast. It's in the description down below. I know, obviously, I forgot something that I just listened to on it, but that's not his fault. It's my fault. Go check it out. It is my favorite way to consume the American Revolution. Another big thank you to Michael. I'm sure he'll be back to talk about more British and American founders very frequently. If you're new here, definitely hit like. Well, hit like either way, but if you're new here, subscribe for American Revolution 5 days a week.